There have been few figures that have been so consistently romanticized in modern pulp culture as the image of the noble Scottish Highlander. In series and movies such as Braveheart, Rob Roy, Outlander, etc., 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 Highlanders have been portrayed as essentially freedom-loving,
that they may take our lives, but they'll never take our freedom!
honorable,
Honor is what no man can give you, and none can take away. Honor is a man's gift to himself.
Do women have it?
Women are the heart of honor, and we cherish and protect it in them. You must never mistreat a woman or malign a man, nor stand by and see another do so.
as formidable warriors, as kilted hotties who always protect their womenfolk, especially against the hated English.
It's Fraser, James, Alexander, Malcolm, Mackenzie, Fraser.
But how true to the historical record is this trope? Was this the reality of Scottish history? Or is the image of the honorable Scottish Highlander just BS? Let's talk about it.
Are you from the Isle of Lewis, or it's at the hills of Harris? Are you from the north of US, or it's at the Isle of Skye?
Greetings. I'm Dr. Doug Campbell, and I'll just admit from the very beginning here that I am as vulnerable to this romanticization of Scottish history and the image of the Highlander as anybody, perhaps more so. Quite a few of my ancestors hailed from Scotland. I've been there several times. I've even been known to wear the kilt upon occasion. Heck, I've worn it doing ultramarathons. And to be sure, some of the outlines of this romanticized vision of Scottish history are broadly true. There was an actual William Wallace who fought against the English and for Scottish independence in the 13th century, even if that is practically the only detail that Mel Gibson's film got right. Scottish participation in the Jacobite uprisings to restore the royal house of Stuart between 1689 and 1746 was extensive and enthusiastic before their eventual defeat to Hanoverian forces on Culloden Moor. Far be it from me to ever deny that the English historically frequently have been enormous pricks.
Some people hate the English, I don't. They're just wankers. We, on the other hand, are colonised by wankers. Can't even find a decent culture to be colonised by. We're ruled by effete arseholes. It's a shite state of affairs to be in, Tommy, and all the fresh air in the world won't make any fucking difference.
Who persecuted the Scots alongside a variety of other peoples all over the planet. Scotland was fully incorporated into the British Empire with the Act of Union in 1707, and after Culloden, Parliament banned kilt-wearing and other forms of Highland dress in an attempt to stifle Scottish national sentiment. The speaking of Gaelic likewise was discouraged and went into a steep decline. There were also the notorious Highland clearances of the 19th century, which saw entire communities forced off their farms to make way for more profitable cattle and sheep herding, and resettled either in the lowlands, England, or across the Atlantic in North America. And in the face of all those crises and challenges, the Scots endured with their spirit intact, cultivating the mordant sense of humor for which they have long been famous. Yet that's only part of the story. In order to provide a more complete view, let me set a scene. It involves me at perhaps 8 years old, enraptured as my father read me a chapter of Robert Louis Stevenson's classic 1886 adventure novel Kidnapped before bed. In one part of the book, the young protagonist, David Balfour, mentioned in passing to his stalwart Jacobite defender, the noble Highlander Alan Breck Stewart, his friendship with a man with the surname Campbell. Alan retorted, and I'm not even going to try a Scottish accent here, that would just be offensive, "I know nothing I would help a Campbell to, unless it was a leaden bullet. If I lay dying, I would crawl upon my knees to my chamber window for a shot at one. Keep in mind, my name, lest you weren't paying attention, is the thoroughly Scottish Douglas Campbell. And the younger version of me was aghast to hear one of the good guys in a book set in Scottish history referring to people with my surname as if they were the worst villains imaginable, which in a certain sense they absolutely were. So as a counterbalance to the honorable, long-suffering Highlander, I give you the folks with whom I share a surname, the powerful and ruthless Clan Campbell. So what is a clan exactly? Well, it's a kinship group that features a clan chief as an aristocratic patriarch who provided protection and patronage for his extended family, many of whom might have only been distantly related to him, in exchange for their loyalty and military service. The clan system was essentially a Scottish version of European feudalism, but this system persisted for longer in the Highlands than in lands further south precisely because so much of this region was mountainous and poorly suited for large-scale agriculture. Most farming there tended to be subsistence-based and hence not terribly profitable. Indeed, this is as good a place as any to note that most Scots then, and indeed now, were not actually Highlanders, but rather lived in the lowland regions of the south, which were more agriculturally productive. The Campbells were perhaps the single most successful clan, based as they were in Argyll and Breadalbane in the southeast of the Highlands, adjacent to the lowlands, which were more populous, more economically dynamic, and more closely integrated into the larger British system. So the Campbells then constituted a quasi-imperial power in parts of Scotland which ruthlessly pursued its interests at the expense of other influential clans. Indeed, the power of Clan Campbell was the source of their long-standing beef with the royal house of Stuart. Let's not forget in our enthusiasm to throw shade on the hated English that it was actually the Scottish King James VI of Stuart who initiated the enduring union between Scotland and its southern neighbor when he was crowned James I of England in 1603. So the inclusion of the Highlands into a larger British system ironically began under the same Stuart dynasty, which would be the rallying point of the later Jacobite rising. James VI and I worked to extend state authority further into Scotland, and thus he and his successors had to reckon with the Campbells, who resented their influence. Certainly there was no love lost between the Stuarts and the Campbells. James VI/2, grandson of his namesake, engineered the execution of Archibald Campbell, Earl of Argyll, in 1685, and the Campbells returned the favor by supporting the Glorious Revolution of 1688, in which that same James was removed from the throne in favor of the new monarchs William and Mary. The Jacobite cause, which fought for first the return of James, then of his son, and then his grandson, Charles Edward Stuart, aka Bonnie Prince Charlie, who you've probably heard of, was always staunchly opposed by the Campbells. And indeed, they were not alone. Substantial numbers of not just the Campbells, but also the clans of Mackay, Monroe, Ross, Gunn, and Mackenzie were also anti-Jacobite. No less than 10 of the 50 major Highland clans fought against the return of the Stuarts to the throne. The terrain of the remaining clan loyalties was complex and shifting. Some clans were divided between support for the various factions. Many were simply neutral. Some failed to declare allegiance to the Jacobite cause out of fear of reprisal, even if they might have been sympathetic to it. This certainly illustrates the extent to which the Jacobite uprisings cannot be viewed as some sort of Scottish national movement or war of national liberation. Scots, whether of the Highlands or the Lowlands, fought on both sides, as indeed did the English. This was a general British Civil War. It is in this context that we have to mention the infamous massacre at Glencoe in 1692. In this episode, anti-Jacobite forces killed some 30 men, women, and children as a punishment for the clan chief's tardiness in swearing an oath of loyalty to King William. Royalist troops had been the guests of the MacDonalds, who controlled the region, and yet turned against them in an abrogation of Highland rules of honor which is echoed down the centuries, and which is at least one of the historical precedents for the Red Wedding in George R.R. Martin's Game of Thrones series. This bloody betrayal has been notorious ever since, and perhaps unsurprisingly, we dastardly Campbells were right in the middle of it, as one Robert Campbell was the commander of the murderous Royalist force, which also included quite a few of his kinsmen among the perpetrators. I may seem like an apologist for my lineage, but I must nonetheless note that this was not simply a Campbell vendetta against the MacDonalds, however, but rather the massacre was part of a broader attempt by the British Crown to suppress Scottish resistance through terror. Indeed, while we're throwing cope at Glencoe, we can also note that the massacre seemed outrageous at the time, in part because the Highlands were already far more peaceful and less prone to interclan violence than they had been a century earlier. During the 1500s, Glencoe might have been simply one among dozens of examples of interclan violence, which was relatively common. Also, for the record, I've been to Glencoe, and it's a stunningly beautiful place. If you're going to murder somebody, or I suppose be murdered, you could do a lot worse. Likewise, let's also state for the record that the Campbells fought at Culloden in 1746 against the Jacobites, and thus were instrumental in ensuring the ultimate failure of that cause. Why do I keep bringing up these awful Campbells, beyond, I suppose, a narcissistic desire to just talk about myself in one of my videos? Well, Clan Campbell is sort of the antithesis of the stereotype of the honorable Scottish Highlander. We were power-hungry, ruthless, and determinedly dishonorable. And yet the Campbells themselves were in many ways the single most successful Highland clan in all of the history of Scotland. That's an important part of this story too, and it doesn't fit with this sort of Hollywood version of the noble Highlander. Let's also take on the Highland clearances for a bit. Again, we're not denying that this stuff happened or that it was awful, but we're attempting to locate it within the larger context of what was going on in the history of Northern Europe. The removal of some Scottish communities from their traditional farms happened not simply because of the greed of their landlords, but rather because of the broader transition of the island of Britain from feudal, subsistence-based agriculture, referred to in Gaelic as the Runrig system, to an enclosed system of capitalist farming based on cattle and sheep herding, and to a lesser extent the cultivation of kelp in the coastal and island regions. Yes, that was a thing. It was sort of used in various industries. Don't ask, we don't have time. Kelp. These social systems were in a broader state of upheaval throughout the Western world, and the fact that these changes came to Scotland later than in England should not obscure the fact that the process was more or less the same. Aristocratic landlords in Scotland were subject to the same pressures and incentives as elsewhere in the nascent British capitalist system. If they wanted to keep their lands, they had to make it profitable. Runrig had to give way to more lucrative modes of production. Some landowners were humane. They tried to support their Highland tenants throughout these changes. Others were kind of jerks and ruthlessly forced them to resettle elsewhere, whether south in the Highlands, into England, or across the ocean in Canada and North America. Some, such as James Matheson, the Stornoway businessman, who actually made his fortune dealing dope to China in the form of opium, tried one approach and then the other, first supporting his tenants and then basically clearing them off the Isle of Lewis. So no matter what the personal disposition of the landlord in question, whether virtuous or vicious, this was part of a larger set of economic changes that were sweeping through Scotland at the time. It was far larger than just some people were mean. This was a systemic change. And I don't think to note that minimizes the suffering of the individual families that were dispossessed in the clearances, but it just provides us with a little bit more understanding of why this happened. And let's also talk about what some of these dispossessed Highlanders did. Many of the very same Highland warriors who were so renowned for their military prowess fighting against the British Crown were subsequently employed by that same royal power as soldiers under its banner. The 42nd Highland Regiment of Foot, known in Gaelic as Amfrecadandu, the Black Watch, became one of the most effective fighting forces in the cause of the British Empire during the next several centuries. The Black Watch was permitted to wear Highland dress at a time when it was prohibited elsewhere in Scotland, and it featured substantial participation by the clans of Monroe, Fraser, Grant, and, you guessed it, Campbells. Highlanders were used as soldiers of the Empire in the three great wars of the later 18th century: the 7 Years' War, we know it on this side of the pond as the French and Indian War, the American Revolutionary War, and the Wars of the French Revolution and Napoleon. They were also employed at the same time as the British government was suppressing Gaelic language and culture and relocating the Scots off their land, to themselves serve as agents who inflicted similar suffering on the indigenous peoples of North America. So Scots and Irish, often themselves victims of the English on one side of the Atlantic, served as agents of that same oppression on the other. Ultimately, in Britain, there was a revival of enthusiasm for Scottish culture in the 1800s. Thanks in part to the Waverley novels of Walter Scott, the image of the Highlander shifted from one of barbarous disloyalty to rugged romantic courage and honor. There was a vogue for kilts and tartans, and a boom in tourism to experience the stunning beauty of the Highlands, which has endured to the present day. But this romanticism for the Highlands and their people obscures the full richness of Scottish history. For an overall view of the clan system and the history of the Scottish clans in the Highlands, one might recommend Alistair Moffat's The Highland Clans from 2013. For a more accurate vision of William Wallace and the rebellion he was involved in than what you see in Braveheart, not that that would be hard, Graeme Morton's William Wallace, Man and Myth from 2001 is your go-to. Jacqueline Writing's Jacobites, A New History of the 45 Rebellion from 2016 is a good overview of the Jacobite uprisings. And T.M. Devine's The Scottish Clearances, A History of the Dispossessed, 1600 to 1900, published in 2019, is an excellent overview of some of the economic changes we've been talking about. So is the image of the Honorable Highlander B.S.? I mean, I guess you'd have to say yes insofar as it is incomplete. Like, obviously, there were some Highlanders who were brave and honorable and noble, and all of those things that you see in the movies. But so too were there some straight up villains and scumbags in Scottish history. And none of this should be surprising. This is true of every single group of people in the history of our species. We are a widely mixed bag, and I think it does the true richness of any group's story a tremendous disservice to just pretend it's all an instance of good guys versus bad guys. And moreover, lots of modern Scottish history is best understood within the context of the larger story of the origins of the modern capitalist system in which we are all enmeshed in the 21st century. And, which goes far beyond matters of individual virtue or villainy. And yes, you definitely shouldn't trust those Campbells. They are historically quite treacherous, although if I may say, damn, don't we know how to pick a winner. That's all I got for you. Make sure to check your sources and evidence. See ya.